Okay, so hello and warm welcome to today's webinar. This is the second of a series of 3 PAR events that we have scheduled, and they have run between April and October of this year. The first webinar, you may recall, focused on what was delivered in release 0.3 of PAR, and we spent some time demonstrating some of that new functionality to you. So this webinar will focus just on the 3 core components of PAR, which are the PAR data model, PAR tools, and PAR integrations. And what we're hoping to do is use the outputs from this workshop to help us prioritize some of the development tasks that will be associated with the next and future releases of PAR. Today's webinar will be split into 2 distinct parts. In the first part, Justin's going to provide an overview of the PAR concepts, and that will include things such as preservation actions, preservation rules, some of the tools and objects associated with PAR. John Tilbury will then outline the high-level roadmap of PAR and will also provide a practical demonstration of some of those concepts. After the break, so that's the second part of the workshop, we will focus just on the 3 core components of PAR. As I mentioned, that's the data model, the tools, and the integration parts of PAR. We'll then ask participants to get involved by being assigned to a specific breakout room where one of those topics will be examined in detail. These breakout sessions have been designed to be as interactive as possible, so it's a good opportunity for you to get involved. At the end of the breakout session, we will then reconvene for a collective review of each session, and as Charlotte mentioned at the start, we'll also have an open Q&A. At the end of this session altogether, we'll also have a questionnaire that we would like you to complete, and we'll send that out after today's webinar. So moving on, since the last webinar, we've created a new GitHub repo, which can be found at github.com/openpreserve/PAR. The new repo includes a set of GitHub pages that provide an overview of PAR, its long-term vision, which is basically aimed at sharing good practice across the community, an outline of the high-level roadmap, and the process by which the community can get directly involved with PAR over the longer term. Repo still does require some further work, but in the fairly near future, it will include a list of issues that will detail specific areas of PAR development, and they're the areas that we'd really like you to get involved with. The pages can in the short term be found at https://parcore.org. Today's presenters include Justin Simpson of Artifactual, John Tilbury and Jack O'Sullivan of Preservica, Matthew from Archivem, Becky, Charlotte, Carl, and myself from the OPF. So without further ado, I will pass you over to Justin Simpson, who will start talking about PAR entities and PAR concepts. Thanks very much.
Introduce myself for anyone who doesn't know. I'm the managing director of Artifactual Systems based in Vancouver, British Columbia, west coast of Canada. And I'm going to talk about the PAR data model and just give an overview of the main entities in that data model. So here is the diagram that we included in the original paper, which is linked here, describing the PAR data model. I'm going to go through this, focusing on just a couple of the entities in more detail. So within the PAR data model, there are really 6 main entities that we've defined, and these each have their own JSON schema that describes exactly what their properties are. There are a couple of other entities that we haven't actually created JSON schemas for. We didn't actually need them in our work in mapping Archivematica and Preservica preservation actions and rules to PAR, so we didn't implement them yet. There are also 4 other kind of concepts that have their own schema, but we've included them in one JSON schema called types. So they're sort of smaller entities that we wanted to make sure we could link to. So I'm going to start really by just going over these 2 main concepts, the idea of preservation actions and business rules. This is kind of the heart of the PAR model. So preservation action really means something that needs to be done as part of digital preservation. So it would be something like one of the items listed here on the left. And the business rule is an idea that's meant to provide context for which preservation actions you've chosen. So you might want to describe which tool works best for a given situation, or have the ability to describe preferences for one tool over another tool, or for why you are choosing to perform certain kinds of preservation actions on certain types of content. So I'll get into this in a little more detail. First, by starting with preservation actions. So preservation action, as I said, is something that is done as part of digital preservation. You describe a tool that can execute this preservation action, and you can optionally control or configure how this works with a set of constraints. And then you can link preservation actions to business rules so that they are provided context. So the preservation action will also list a preservation action type. I'll kind of get into that in a little bit more, but fundamentally that is which preservation action are you performing. You can describe whether the inputs are files or properties. So you can say that it's any file with a particular property, or in fact, you can just say that the input to this preservation action is actually just metadata elements, not actually a digital object. You describe the tool that you will use, and then you can provide input tool arguments, which are command line or other types of parameters that are required to make the tool work the way you want. So when you run a preservation action, it results in creating derivatives for you potentially, either a file, a digital object, a raw output, or a property. So when we talk about inputs, every preservation action must have some input, either one or more files or one or more properties. You can combine those if you want. And then the outputs, as I mentioned, files, properties, and raw outputs. By raw output, we mean generally something like the output you'd have from the command line of running a tool. For example, running a tool like media info, it can give you different kinds of output. XML is one of them, or you may interact with the REST API of some kind of web service and receive JSON back, and you choose to store that raw output as well as or instead of specific metadata elements. And so the schema for a preservation action is defined here, and as you can see, there are a number of sort of required elements and then a few optional ones. So we've described the inputs and outputs a little bit. The constraints can be properties or formats. So in the PAR model, a file format is modeled as a separate sort of first-class entity, but any kind of property you want can be used as a constraint. So you can say only videos with a certain height and width would this rule apply to, for example, or literally any other kind of property that you want to choose to define. You can also sort of include just a free text to describe an example, and you can explain, you can indicate when the last time this rule was modified. Now I'll describe a business rule. So business rules are really just a way to provide context to the preservation action. This text I've put here comes directly from the JSON schema. It's so far the kind of description of what a business rule is meant to do. The idea of business rules is definitely one of the areas where we can see potentially further development of the PAR model. Right now they are very narrative. They're not something that can be really machine actionable, and we'd like to explore that more. So a business rule, again, you can sort of decide which preservation actions this business rule applies to. As an example, you may have a particular tool that can do more than one thing. It can be used for metadata extraction as well as validation, and you may choose a business rule to say we only use this tool for one of those purposes. You can also list more than one preservation action. So you can say that we have tools like Fido or Siegfried or Droid, and all three of these work with the preservation action of file format identification. But you can prioritize them, or you can you can say use this tool is preferred, and this other tool is used as a second choice. And then you can define constraints to say exactly how you use these preservation actions. So this should give you a list of preservation actions to use in particular situations, and information about what inputs to provide them, and expectations about what you should be getting back, whether it's a file or metadata or raw output. As you can see in the schema for business rules, really only the identifier is required. Everything else is optional. Mostly we have so far really put information into notes and description. We can link preservation actions to business rules, but they are the structure of the business rule so far is mostly just a narrative way of providing context to a preservation action. I'll just quickly go over some of these other entities, the words you'll hear when you're looking through the model. When we say a tool, we really mean either a command line tool or an application or a REST API for a web service. It could be anything, but it's something that's used to perform preservation actions. And we're trying to make that as generic as possible. And then when we talk about properties, we're really talking about any attribute that either a file or an object could have. These are things really from PAR's perspective that are either inputs that you need to use sort of for filtering or constraining preservation actions, or they are metadata elements that a preservation action is going to provide for you. So doing a metadata extraction preservation action that returns you detailed information about like in EBU core format, for example. Each of those, the height, the width, the codec, etc., would be PAR properties. We talk about preservation action types. We have described them as using the Library of Congress's preservation event type controlled vocabulary. So these are really just the actions that you take that are relevant to digital preservation. You don't have to use the Library of Congress controlled vocabulary. I've provided a link here in the slides, which goes to an example in Archivematica, where there's a preservation action that's that can happen that's specific to Archivematica, that's not listed in the controlled vocabulary. You can do that with PAR. Similarly, format, when the concept of a format in PAR really means a file format as defined by a pronom ID using the National Archives of the UK's pronom registry. It is also possible to locally define formats. Again, there's another link from Archivematica that shows a generic image format, so that doesn't have a specific pronom ID identified. And then I mentioned at the beginning, we have these sort of helper concepts, fundamentally a file, which is very rudimentarily defined in PAR, just as something that's a digital object that you could have as an input or an output from a preservation action. And then, input tool arguments are the parameters that you would pass to whatever tool you're running. We also have the concept of a format family, which is a very simple way of grouping formats together. So you could define a format family really any way you want. It's just saying, I expect these formats to all act together. It allows you to constrain preservation actions to work on particular groups of formats without necessarily having to list all of the formats. PAR also defines the concept of an identifier, which allows you to say sort of effectively namespace identifiers. So to say this is an Archivematica identifier, or an identifier from pronom, or an identifier from Preservica, etc. And the last thing I'll just talk about is we have this idea of preservation action constraints, which is defined in the data model, which really just is ways of saying when you're running a preservation action, are you giving a list of allowed formats? So this action works on the following list, or does this preservation action only work when you have a set of properties of which you must have all of them, or does it work as long as you have at least one of a set of properties? And you can also constrain a preservation action by an input item name, which is really just defined as a string. It could be anything. It's up to the writer to decide what they want that to mean. Typically, it might mean this works on a particular input file. So in all of this that we've gone over here, there are a number of ways in which we're interested in potentially extending this data model. The main purpose we've had so far is to make sure that it's possible to describe preservation actions in a way that is understandable regardless of the preservation system where that action is implemented. So we've had the specific use case of looking at preservation actions as they're implemented in Archivematica and in Preservica, and also in Archivem service, which is uses Archivematica but has extensions that have been added by Archivem. And so being able to compare across those three systems, that's been the main use case for how the model has developed so far. And so now we're interested in looking at how to make it more generally useful. But I'm going to stop there. That's the end of my section, and now pass on to John Tilbury, who's going to talk about roadmap and those three examples.
Okay, so thank you very much to Justin for going through the sort of theory of PAR and the data model, and a huge amount of work has gone into trying to write a very generic data model for digital preservation actions that is compatible with different products. And that's the key, that this is linking the actions of products that have a common purpose, but that work quite differently, to try and make sure that we can have a consistent approach, that the two products currently supported and many others in the future can talk to each other. So that's a key point at the moment. You've got different competitors, really, rivals certainly, working cooperatively to try and get the free flow of information between their systems. So what I'd like to do now is just quickly show you some of the work that has been completed, and then we can look at the work we know that has to be done in the future. So both Preservica, Archivematica and Archivem have created PAR endpoints that you can go to, and you can try out the various different endpoints, the various different entities that Jason was just talking about. So you can see here the Archivematica URL. Don't worry about copying it down. The slides will be distributed and you'll be able to get the URL, and you can go to that and you can have a look at the PAR endpoint for Archivematica. Now, clearly this is for people who enjoy reading JSON, and Preservica has a similar equivalent. This uses a Swagger endpoint. Here's the business rules one that Jason was mentioning. You can do again. You can see here there's a try it out option as well, as there is in Archivematica. So you can click on this, you can actually run this against a live registry for both systems, and you can get the JSON back and be very excited. Now, many people on this call will get excited by JSON. Many people will not even know what it stands for and would prefer their data to be served up in a human readable form. So what we have done is we've created a simple user interface, and it must be simple because I threw it together, that enables you to look at the contents of an Archivem, Archivematica and Preservica registry using an identical user interface sitting on top of the PAR API. So the URL is here. This is live now, and if you go to that URL, you'll be able to register. You do have to do a user registration process so that we can just see who's using the interface and just keep in touch with them. And just to emphasize, this information is not used for any commercial purposes whatsoever. It is used by the PAR members, all of the PAR members, to just keep in touch with people and their interest in PAR. But if you register here, you will be able to look at any of the PAR browsers. The first thing you do is you go to the setup page. see the setup option on the top right-hand corner. You click on the drop-down and you'll get a drop-down option to say whether you want to use Preservica, Archivematica, or Archivem. You pick one of those and you can start using the system. So you're now able to browse these systems and see what they're actually doing. Human readable form. So let's just have a look at these live and see where we get to. So this is currently set up for Preservica. And there's a raw thing here which I'll explain later, just to see the API, what the API returns. And then you can say, show me all the formats. So in Preservica, this is stuff that's just come out of Pronom. So we just take a copy of Pronom here, or you can search for a specific file format. So I'm going to, because and this is a PUID, and I know it's not, you know, not everyone remembers all of the PUIDs. You have to page through the files to find the one you want. But if you remember your PUIDs, you can search for a particular PUID. So here is everything that Preservica knows about TIFF. And you can look down, it's got the Pronom signature, it's got related formats. And if you know about TIFF, you'll know that there are many other formats that are also conform to TIFF that are sort of supersets of TIFF, like Canon RAW or Digital Negative, etc. But then we can say, well, tell me what business rules you have for TIFF. And we click on this, and this will show us all of the business rules that are defined for this TIFF format. So now it's starting to get interesting. So actually we want to look at things that migrate TIFF to JPEG. So tell me about that particular business rule. This is now going to go away and it's going to gather all of the information. It takes a little bit of time because there's a big need denormalization on this one because there are so many different things that use the same business rule. And you can see here is the business rule. Now, Preservica implements the formats this applies to here. Archivematica does it slightly different as a constraint on the preservation action, but we can come back to that a little bit later. So here we come. This is a preservation action type of migration. It has a preservation action name, and it has all the formats it applies to. So this is something we think is sensible to do. And so we can click on that preservation action and it tells us all the details. And we can see here that preservation, this uses a tool, ImageMagick command line interface. It shows us how it runs, shows us where you get it from, etc. And you can see all of the inputs and on that particular preservation action. So this is, and then you can click through and say, tell me more about preservation, about the tool, and it tells you about everything about the tool. So from the information in that stack, you could go away and you could say, that's very interesting. I would like to do exactly like that in my digital preservation system, which isn't Preservica and isn't Archivematica and isn't Archivem, and I'd like to try that out. And there should be sufficient information in what we've just done for you to go away and implement it. We know we can't immediately go through and do it without a little bit of cutting and pasting at the moment, but you can certainly see all the information you need to make some decisions. We can see other things that use ImageMagick. So there are other preservation actions, and sure enough, ImageMagick is a very versatile tool. So there's something to migrate to JPEG 2000, and we can say, well, tell me all about that. This is how you migrate to JPEG 2000, etc. So there's an awful lot of stuff here. There's a list of all the tools we support, and so on that you can go to. So that's fine for Preservica. Let's have a look at Archivematica, and we can see here. Say we sort of thing. We want to look for TIFF again. And it's just, there's not so much defined for TIFF in Archivematica. In fact, most of the other stuff we've got in Preservica is just a copy of what's in Pronom. Well, I'm not going to claim we did anything special. It's just a straight copy. But we can say, show me the business rules for TIFF, and you'll see a pretty similar sort of setup here. There's things that create thumbnails and create access copies. Well, that's probably pretty similar to what we saw for converting JPEGs. Archivematica does it in a slightly different way, and it's a 3-step process using 3 preservation actions, which is an interesting variation. And we can say, well, show us this convert to JPEG using this convert tool. Here is an example of it in use, and so on. So that's really quite useful in terms of us in Preservica saying, well, let's see if Archivematica is better than us, and we can copy that, and vice versa. So as a community, we're growing immediately and making it really, really easy for us all to share information. We can change to, oh no, sorry, let me just go back, and I want to look at all the preservation tools in Archivematica. You can see there are 22 tools. It's pretty similar in Preservica. We sweat a few tools by building up preservation actions and business rules on top of them. And we can see, but if we go to Archivem, we can see that Archivem has added a few extra tools in. So some Archivem specific tools down here. So there's one to create PDFAs from Microsoft Office, and you can see how they do it. Here are the actions using this tool, and so on. So you can see that Archivem has a few extra tools and preservation rules over the top of Archivem. I mentioned one thing on Archivematica, sorry. There's a slight glitch in the user interface, which means you can't see the constraints currently on a business rule, on a preservation action, which is where they define which formats an action will run. And we'll be adding that one back in shortly. That's just a slight bug at the moment. That'll be coming back in. But this URL, this is live. You can log on and register now. You can try it out, and hopefully that will inspire you to think of PAR not as an interesting research concept, but something that actually exists now, and you could start using now to learn about what the 3 different systems do to improve best practice. And what we really hope, of course, is you come back and say, actually, there's another tool you haven't thought of. So there's a discussion moment at one of the main lists about what to do about digital negatives and what the best tool to convert camera raw formats into digital negative. I'm tracking that conversation because I would like to know which tool people think is best, and then we can add it into Preservica and it will appear as a tool, and we'll create preservation actions for the 15 or so camera raw support files that are in Pronom, and there we go. That's all done. That will then become published, and people can go and look at how we've wrapped it up, and we can say in that conversation, look, here's a link to how we've done it. Please feel free to copy it if you think better. And that's the way it should be. You know, we're a commercial organization, as our Archivem and as our Artifactual. We have different business models, but we all exist to make a profit for our businesses and to make sure they continue in business. However, we all acknowledge that by working together on these knotty problems, we'll all make much better progress. And so that's what we're hoping to do. Okay, so now let's go back to the presentations and quickly just have a look at the ideas we've got for the future. So we have got a functioning GUI. It's not really comprehensive and it needs finishing off. For example, error checking every field. The trouble with PAR is so many of the fields are optional that you've got to error check every field to check you've got that back. And I'll be honest, I did this quickly and I haven't put that in yet. Once that's in, we will open source that. We'll put it on the GitHub and you can set up and run it if you want, or you can use R1 if you like as well. And we'll leave that hosted on one of our servers so that you can try it out. But there's a lot of improvements we need to do. So on the data model side, we mentioned where preservation actions are done in a line, but it's not especially convincing at the moment. So this is where you sequence a set of actions to create a super action, and potentially doing that a lot more comprehensively and in a much more of a watertight way. So that's one thing we could do to make much more complex actions from individual smaller actions. Provenance is a big thing, and this is something that was discussed at IPRES in Amsterdam last year, is how do I know where this rule came from and who signed it up? So if we push out a rule, do you want to know that Preservica endorses that rule, or Artifactual endorses a rule, or Archivem endorses a rule, or who else publishes the system, created this rule and who endorsed it? So do we want a way of signing these records so that we know exactly who created them and who takes responsibility for them? Or would that be an impediment? Would the overhead that implies frighten people off from publishing things? Identifiers is something that Jason touched on, but really we haven't gone as far as we could do with identifiers. In the integrations workshop, we'll be talking about the NARA advice that was recently published, and a huge piece of work it is. And that has identifiers for every other possible variant. So if you look at NARA ND001373, I just made that up, by the way, and that turns out to be JPEG, it'll tell you what that is in PUID, British Library, Library of Congress, MIME types, Wikipedia, everything. It'll give you links for everything, which is incredibly useful. But the PAR model doesn't quite cover all those variants yet. Also, qualitative justification. At the moment, there's a notes field, but it's not especially big. You know, do we want to leave space for people to add comments, to people to say when this business rule is applicable, or issues that happen with a particular tool? So, for example, this tool can be used to migrate Macromedia Flash videos to create an MP4 streaming video. Perfectly sensible preservation action, except we all know that Macromedia Flash can also contain animations or applications that don't migrate. Do you want to put that qualitative thing in on that preservation tool to say, works for some Flash files, but not for others in these circumstances? So that's a bit more text and context and description. Or do you want to put, if you're a particular institution that's publishing your digital preservation policy, put some context in there to explain to consumers of this why you have recommended a particular course of action. So those are all things in the data that could be used to extend the data model to have different types of information in them. On the tools front, I've shown you a very basic GUI for view, and I think you know, extending and finishing that off is one thing, but how about turning that into an editor as well, so that you could edit and maintain a registry via that GUI? Now, that would be a pretty useful and consistent way of managing all the content of all three systems via the same GUI. But more importantly, would allow, if you had a back-end registry, because the GUI sits on top of an API that sits on top of either the registries from Archivematica or Preservica. But what if we also distributed an actual database that you could save things in? That would mean that you wouldn't need to have any of those three systems to create your own registry and publish your own advice, so that other people could see it. So that would be really quite interesting and useful. And that would bring us on to some form of synchronization capability. where you could take one particular registry and automatically copy it and extend it to another registry. So you could say, I want this registry for this category of content to just keep it up to date with the master. But for this other category, I want to take it from this other system. And so you get registry synchronization using the PAR API as a common language. That would mean API extensions to handle all the data model stuff we've talked about, and search and sort as the person who put together the GUI. Those are the two obvious things that are missing. You don't want to search for FMT 353. You want to search for TIFF. And so having some form of free text indexing and searching would be very useful. And sorting is the other thing. The APIs don't have a sort capability. The stuff comes out in the order they like. And so sometimes that can lead to rather odd ordering of stuff and make it quite difficult to find things, particularly in the file format database, which of course tends to be, it's got about 1,800 entries for both. Integrations. So this is putting PAR and that PAR API onto some other sources of information. We are currently working with on a Wikidata front end that would allow PAR data to be published from Wikidata. And we'll mention that in the integrations team, how that's progressing. Of course, it would be great to read pronom data using a PAR interface. I mean, they do have an API, but if they use the same API as everyone else, that would be great, because we can just read the latest pronom, or potentially read the draft pronom. Read me the current pronom advice with all the droid signatures for the stuff that you're thinking of publishing in 2 months' time. Then I can download it and try it out and get back to the pronom team and say, I found some TIFF files this fails with. Or I found that the way you've changed TIFF means that Hasselblad RAW is now, instead of being identified as Hasselblad RAW, is now identified as TIFF, which is what happened in the recent release. But if that was put out in advance, using a PAR API, people could try it out and comment and support the team, the TNA that do such tremendous work. The NARA advice, which is just published, it would be great to read that in an actionable form, and I'll discuss this in the Arca integrations workshop. And also FDD, MIME type, Wikipedia. There's all sorts of other different sources of information that could be have PAR interfaces that would allow us to read them using that same GUI, to consume them and to copy them and to action them immediately. So these are all suggestions. All of the PAR partners have put a lot of their own effort and time and development effort into this, and have got it to sort of a version 0.1. But we're looking for your ideas on what the roadmap should contain, and ultimately your ideas of who can provide resources to do that. Be that sponsored development, be that, you know, a couple of months of a developer who would like to do it, be that people working on a PhD project or a master's project who want some stuff to do. You know, some effort to do some of these things would also be gratefully accepted, but let's at least identify what the priorities are. Okay, that's all I'm going to say. I'm just going to pass back to Justin and Becky now to talk.
Set this up where we're going to have 3 separate breakout groups after our break. We're going to talk about the sort of 3 categories of the roadmap that John described. And in each of those breakout groups, we want to, you know, we will present some information about the topics we've identified that we think need to be in the roadmap, give our explanation of why those are issues or what could potentially be done. And then we want to have a discussion with the group about, you know, are there other possible improvements we've missed? Are these ideas, how can they be refined or better explained? And talk a bit about the priorities for them. Then at the end of that breakout groups, we will come back into the one main room here to get a bit of reporting back from each of the groups. I guess we can go through the feedback now. I think we're going to go through one breakout session at a time, just do few minutes on each one.
And are you happy to start, Justin?
Sure.
Yeah,
So
okay.
I guess we have these collaborative notes. So the link that from earlier in these slides takes you to a page that should link out to all three of them. If I was to summarize what happened in the data model breakout, we discussed primarily three main potential issues. One was around sequencing. So how should individual preservation actions be fit together if you have a set of them you want to run in sequence? The second issue was around provenance. So how do you know when something was changed, a preservation action or a business rule? How do you know who wrote this, or whether they're actually using it, or it's just an idea that they came up with? And then the third one was around qualitative justification. So this idea of how do we provide more structured ways for people to have sort of free text properties in business rules, for example, to describe their opinion or advice, or just provide better context. We also talked a little bit about the issue of identifiers, but I think we kind of agreed generally that provenance was the most important of those ones, the thing to work on first. There's not as much point in understanding how to sequence actions if you don't trust them. So thinking about provenance and then qualitative justification as the second priority. And also we kind of talked about the need to maybe rank or rate. So there's a relationship between the provenance and the qualitative justification. It might be necessary to say not just like have information from the person who authored the rule, but the ability for other people to comment on it, to say this one worked for us and we're using it as well. So that there was some good feedback there that we can use to sort of define this in the roadmap. And that was about it.
Sure. So we were in a breakout session to discuss some of the tooling and what ways that you would want to actually be able to interact with this data. So I think it's fair to say that some of the questions that turned up in that data model workshop also came up for us. The idea of trust in who's authored these rules and who's using them was sort of mentioned. So whether there's a way to be able to see from the data, well, who's actually tried this, who's using it, who's sort of following this rule, would be something that people potentially interested in. There was a bit of discussion about that sort of, again, crosses over into some of that qualitative explanation of, is there a way to report on things that maybe didn't work, or the situations in which rules are not going to work, or where preservation actions shouldn't be used rather than just where they should. There was a suggestion that having some way of creating sort of printout reports that are a bit more human readable, something that you can take to your management, would be a useful feature. So that obviously has implications for what kind of questions you can ask of the APIs. And there was a bit of talk at the beginning about the controlled vocabularies that are used or implied or potentially required for making the kind of exchange of information actually work and be implementable in different systems from where the information originated. And I think that broadly covers what we were talking about.
Thanks, Jack. So yeah, sorry if I didn't get chance for everyone to speak. It was a bit tricky to see who was in the group and who wasn't, but I think we had a useful discussion. Quite interesting to talk about integrating two particular registries, NARA and the British Library, into a PAR interface, and both organisations would like to move in that direction when they're ready, which hopefully won't be in too much time. And the use of the WikiDP front end will be a really useful template for them, as both use similar technologies under the hood. So it could be that the PAR front end can be put onto their systems relatively simply. And that will be very exciting, I think, for the project to be able to get those two very high profile organizations publishing information via PAR. I think both brought up again the concept of provenance. I think there's been a misunderstanding that by publishing a particular course of action, that Artifactual or Preservica are recommending it, when really what we're doing is we're saying, no, we got this from so-and-so, they think it's a great idea, which is a different level of trust, which I think is would be really, really useful to distinguish. So that was quite exciting. And provenance isn't just the originator, it's who subsequently tested it out, who made it work in this particular system. So provenance may have multiple fingerprints over it by the time something gets published. So Peter May at the British Library recommended this, John Tilbury at Preservica tested it, and that's now available for everyone to use. And there was a lot of people like the idea of good practice further than best practice, and just saying this is good enough, but also for these purposes. You know, most of the systems currently publish information as being the art of the possible, but not the art of the, and this is what I recommend if you want to do this. And almost like in both in Artifactual and Preservica, there's too much information, and you want to say, if you want to do this, these are the rules you should use. And so that extra level of refinement with reasons justifying why that is appropriate is necessary to make this really interesting. There was some good discussions on archives also publishing transfer information using this mechanism. So saying, these are the formats we'd like you to provide. So it's like a business action of transfer into the archive. And so people could look up, what do you recommend that we send things into you? So it's transfer agreement, if you like, being a preservation action in PAR, which I hadn't considered was a good idea. Also the complexity of data models and variations on different advice for different types of object. For example, different codecs within the media stream, different variants of EPUBs, etc., having different advice. And also multi-part assets being a particular complicated thing, which again, digital preservation as a whole hasn't addressed, let alone PAR, but it's something that we may have to consider. So yeah, so those are the things we covered. If any of my group would like to chip in, please go right ahead. And as I say, sorry if not everyone got a chance to speak.
No, you covered everything that was on my list, John.
Okay, so so we'll use this session as a quick Q&A. If anyone wants to raise anything that either they have been party to today, or anything else that's kind of basically PAR related, we'd be happy to take any questions. Got all the best people here to answer them in Justin, Jack, John, Carl. So yeah, please feel free to ask any questions. And one other thing, what we'll do is also at the end of this session, we'll send you a link, just has a few simple questions on it that again will help us prioritize developments within PAR. And so we'd really like your feedback on that if we can. We'll try and send that as soon as this webinar is completed. If you get that back to us as soon as possible, we'd much appreciate it. In the meantime, open to any questions.
I guess I would quickly like to mention well, first of all, PAR will live or die with people's involvement, excitement, and people talking about it. So please do tweet nice things about the project if you think it's worthy of interest, etc. And please do try out the user interface, the URL we sent round, and have a look and feedback what you think. And please do get involved, because I think this is very exciting. I think this is a way of us all communicating in a way we've never been able to as a community before. And I think but without people's active involvement and publicity and talking about us and making some noise and some energy, it will wither. So please do tweet, talk, get involved, go onto the GUI and play with it, and keep talking to us so that we can all make sure that the project accelerates from here.
Thanks, John. You got anything, Justin, you'd like to add to that, or Jack, or Carl?
I was just going to add that, I think that we've shared a lot of information today, and I think some of the, in these slides, there's quite a few links. So as we'll distribute access to these slides, I would imagine, that I encourage everyone to go and register with that PAR browser John described. Take a look at the APIs that are linked. You may have more questions that come up after you've had more time to sort of look at all of the information here. And we're planning to do another webinar in a month or two's time to be able to kind of describe the progress we've made towards implementing this roadmap or defining this roadmap. And so this is a really good time in the sort of the development of PAR to get input or questions. Doesn't necessarily have to be like just starting with the parts that make sense and don't make sense would be really good. So I encourage everyone to take some time to look over the links and come up with questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Justin. So has anyone got any last opportunity to ask any final questions? If not, we'll close the session down in a minute or so.
It's Samaya here. There's a big silence in the room, so I'll just take the microphone. What do you guys see as the really critical thing that needs to happen next, that isn't just us making sure that this keeps going and gets involved? Like, what are your top 3 things, since there's
John, you want to take,
Justin?
Yeah, I'm looking at John just to see if he's going to start talking first. Or, for me, in Archivematica right now, we have a read-only interface on front. Like we can pull information out of an Archivematica instance and show it in PAR format. We aren't able to push information into Archivematica using PAR right now, and in part that there's some just development work to make that happen. But part of it also is making sure that the data model of PAR actually is machine actionable. Like it still requires a little bit of copying and pasting or tweaking to copy something from one system to another. So I think for me the most critical next thing is having more people looking at preservation actions using this language and seeing that it's actually useful, because that will encourage the development of further work in both Archivematica and in Preservica and in hopefully other systems.
Yeah, I think for me, the concept of being able to group things together for recommendations for a specific purpose is to say, taking it from the art of the possible to the art of the recommended. I think that would be incredibly useful, so that people can pick things from a predefined set of lists. So it's not just, here's everything you can do, fill your boots. It's, here's what I recommend you do in these circumstances. Here's what I recommend you do in these circumstances. And I think that's perhaps would make it a little bit more usable for regular users. And that's something we're going to be looking at in our team in the near future.
that answers your question. Any other questions before we go?
Hello. I guess I do have one tiny question. I am working for a company that is actually a vendor and that does provide a preservation solution. And personally, I find PAR to be very interesting and very promising. But I'm a bit at loss when I would like to argue to my hierarchy, like, let's get involved into this. And when I see other names that they will see as competitors, they're going to say, we don't try to help competitors, although that's not what it is about. So any ideas of how I could maybe come up with good arguments to convince more involvement from my company?
I mean, my first comment to that is to say that as a person who's working, running a company that's providing a preservation systems, there's too much work to be responsible for managing both the framework and being an expert in every possible preservation action that could happen in the world. And so it's a way of reducing cost and making sure that the quality of the preservation actions that happen within your preservation system is higher. So this is making the content collaborative without necessarily the way it's delivered being shared.
Yeah, and I would say that the advantage is that one of the barriers to people taking up digital preservation is it's a bit hard, and they don't feel they have enough information to make decisions. And if the quality and trust of the information used to make digital preservation decisions improves as a result of community endorsement that PAR would enable, then people will make decisions quicker. And so you'll grow the market. The biggest barrier to making commercial success out of digital preservation is the size of the market. And if we can increase the size of the market by people trusting systems and moving ahead more quickly, then you're likely to make more of a success of your business. And PAR is a way of doing that.
Thank you.
But I also encourage you to those are conversations we'd also be happy to have. I mean, the fact that we have Archivem, Preservic, and Artifactual all working together on this project over a couple of years now is a sort of testament to that you can be in competition and still find ways to collaborate.
And if you would like to have that conversation, Morgan, now I'm sure we can arrange something. Even if it's just as an initial kind of exploratory conversation.
All right.
Okay. Any more before we go? Okay. Well, just like to say thank you very much for attending today. Much appreciate your time. Realize that this was a bit of a long session, and your feedback in the individual sessions will be invaluable to us. So just finally, if you'd be kind enough to complete the questionnaire when it comes back, when it goes out to you, we would appreciate that very much. And I think just about ready to sign off and say thanks very much once again. And hopefully you will join us for the third session, which should be somewhere around September time. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.